Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome to Hummingbird Hour. For those of you who might be here with us for the first time, Hummingbird Hour is Hummingbird Humanity's monthly live conversation series where we connect with, usually it's me, sometimes it's other members of the Hummingbird team, and we connect with people making a difference in the world. Right now, we're focused on highlighting authors who have written books that help to create workplaces where humans thrive. Many of these books center around the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation that is so important and so present in our organizations today. And today's conversation is no exception to that conversation around how do we make workplaces better through the lens of belonging. So looking forward to today's conversation. So thank you for being with us. We also encourage that that all of you here are part of our community to connect with each other. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, share where you're zooming in from, share your LinkedIn so people can connect with you. The Hummingbird team will be monitoring the chat and helping to answer questions and offer resources and links there as well. So feel free to engage with the community in the chat as we have today's conversation. So as we kick off today's event, I want to highlight a few of the awareness months that are in progress. So first, we have Pride Month. And certainly as a member of the LGBTQ plus community myself, this is a month that is very special to me. So happy Pride, everyone. And I hope you are finding ways to celebrate in your communities and with your friends and loved ones. We also have Immigrant Heritage Month in progress. And one more, which is the National Caribbean American Heritage Month. I didn't memorize these, I tried, so thank you for the slides prompts, Katie, it's super helpful. Next month for Hummingbird Hour, we have Ray Arata joining us. Ray is the founder of the Better Man Conference, which is an organization that works to include men in the DEI conversation, and we need everyone, including men, to be part of that conversation. So if you're curious to understand about the work that Ray is doing to drive the commitment to human-centered workplace cultures, and through his lens of working with men, join us next month, and we'll learn from Ray. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Rhodes Perry, who is the founder and CEO of Rhodes Perry Consulting. Rhodes has just recently released I think it's your second book, is that right, Rhodes?
Yes, yeah.
Second book, Imagine Belonging. So that's what we're going to spend our time together talking about today. So let me just tell you a little bit about Rhodes to kick off the conversation, and then I'll invite you to share a little bit as well, Rhodes, and say hello to the group. So Rhodes Perry is a best-selling author, sought-after keynoter, and an award-winning social entrepreneur. Nationally recognized as a diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leader, he has 20 years of inclusive leadership experience, having worked at the White House, the Department of Justice, and PFLAG National. Media outlets like Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, and the Associated Press have featured his powerful work. He serves as the CEO of Rhodes Perry Consulting, a global leadership and management consulting firm, helping executives build enduring cultures of belonging. He earned a BA from the University of Notre Dame and an MPA, Masters of Public Administration, from New York University. He also serves on the National LGBTQ plus Chamber of Commerce's Transgender and Gender Expansive Task Force, and on the Cascade AIDS Project's Board of Directors. Rhodes, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Brian. It's great to be here, and hello, everyone. Happy Pride. It's exciting, very exciting.
Happy Pride. What are you doing to celebrate Pride this month, Rhodes?
Well, we had our Pride Festival here in Portland, Oregon last weekend. And I don't know, I mean, every day I feel like the work that I get to do is kind of a Pride celebration year round. So it's very concentrated. So it feels like everyone's invited to the party in June. So yeah, it's just little things here and there. What about yourself?
Well, my community, Wilton Manors in Fort Lauderdale, we had our Pride Festival this past Saturday. So I went to check out that Pride Festival. It was incredibly hot because Florida can be hot in the summer, in case anyone hadn't heard that yet. It was a wonderful celebration, and it was the first. The last Wilton Manors Pride was, they tried last year, but there was a horrible accident that happened, so they had to cancel the festivities. And the year before, it was canceled from COVID. So it was nice to see the life return to that party.
Yeah. It's the in-person events. It seems like this year is the year that many prides are actually happening in person and not kind of like a more curated kind of parade with people inside cars, kind of protecting themselves from COVID. So slowly we're re-entering, I guess, cautiously.
Cautiously and optimistically returning to whatever we're doing now after COVID.
Yes.
So, well, happy Pride, everyone. And I want to give a nod to something that Rhodes said a moment ago, which is, that his work is the celebration of Pride all year, and something that, while I love what you offered there, Rhodes, around June is when everyone's invited to the party. Yeah. We are still gay or queer all year. So if you want to celebrate us any other month of the year or any other day of the year, please feel free to do so.
Yes. Love that.
So as in the introduction, I mentioned that you've written 2 books, and being on the precipice of launching my first book, I'm curious, why did you decide to do it again?
Yeah, that was a question I kept asking myself the second time around. And the reason is that the first book that I wrote, it's called Belonging at Work. And it was really everyday actions that any of us can take to build a more inclusive organization. And it really broke down kind of the what are we talking about? Why does it matter in the workplace? And then how do we do it, right? So pretty basic. And in that last chapter on the how, kind of like jump into inclusive leadership, and I jump into vision setting and really getting leaders in particular to name, what does success look like? What is your long-term vision for building a culture that you can experience on a full sensory level? So what does it look like? What does it sound like? What are you doing? What are these kind of inclusive behaviors that you're doing? And a lot of people really liked that part of the book, and they said, why didn't you start with that part of the book as kind of the belonging book? And my response is that a lot of people don't really understand what it is that we're talking about. It's a pretty elusive concept. So the second book was really for, inclusive leaders, like however you define that, not so much about your positional power, but you want to be a part of shaping culture in inside of your organization. And so that book really breaks down kind of like, what is culture? Like we're swimming in it. So how do we actually name it? What's kind of the role of myself if I'm moving into a leadership position, if I'm building a team, or just, if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm starting my own business, how do I structure an organization with kind of equity in mind from the beginning to kind of build a culture where more of us can show up fully as ourselves? And so that's kind of why, but like your question, why did I do it again? It's a painful process, right? I can really relate to where you're at right now, and just keep on that path, because the way that you're writing about the culture work that you do, only you can do it. And it's going to resonate with a lot of people, like, oh, you finally said that thing that I've been feeling in a way that really makes sense to me. I haven't found that before. So you'll get a lot of that. Yeah, it's very unexpected, and the book will take a life of its own for sure.
Thank you so much. And yeah, and it is, as you've said, the journey to bringing a book to life is a lot. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of challenge. It's a lot of heart and soul. And it's also a lot of joy and excitement and unexpected milestone moments. So I'm thrilled about it. And I joke about you writing the second book. I already have my idea for the second book. Because I kind of caught the bug. So I love, and similarly, it will, assuming I have to get one book out first, but it'll continue the journey of the first book. So I love that I get to learn from you on that journey.
Be careful. You might have 27 books by the time you're all set in. So there's a lot to say, right? There's a lot of work ahead for all of us, right? So I'm glad that you're participating in that process.
Thank you. Well, so you have, You mentioned that that it's hard to understand culture. That culture is this amorphous thing, and you have you've centered your messages around creating a culture of belonging. So, can you help, just for those of us who are here with us today or watching later, to understand how you think about culture and the construct of belonging?
Yeah, definitely. So Trabian Shorters is someone kind of does a lot of culture work, is kind of well versed in this area, and I really like his definition of talking about culture. And he describes it as the transferable set of beliefs and behaviors that allows a social group to survive. And I really like that because it's, there's a lot of definitions on culture. Sometimes they're really abstract and loaded. I like using that definition because I like working with leaders to ask them, right? What are those transferable set of beliefs and behaviors that allows your group to survive, right? Or thrive? What did you learn? And maybe you didn't learn this in your particular organization that you're at, but what did you learn about leadership, right? To allow you to survive and to ascend into the roles that you're in. And would you transfer those behaviors in particular onto the next generation of leaders? And that always sparks like a really interesting conversation. And then when I go into talking about the concept of belonging, which I find that leaders really like talking about that too, because many of them are like, great, I feel this every single day. I love this topic. Let's talk about it. Let's do it. So if they're starting to on kind of that footing, I'm like, okay, great. I'm glad that you have this high sense of belonging. Let's start to imagine those on our team who are least likely to even feel safe showing up in the workplace, and where there might be a disconnect. Do you imagine that anyone inside your workplace might be feeling that? And that opens up a really interesting dialogue too. But when we talk about belonging, to kind of like take it away from this elusive feeling to things that we can actually measure. I really like Co-Qual's research where they broke down belonging into like these 4 ingredients. So they talked about, and I think this is where a lot of us start from, especially during Pride Month, like being seen, right? So being rewarded for all of the genius, all of the talent that you bring into the workplace, and obviously all of those lived experiences that shape who you are, all of the identities that make up who you are, right? And like when you're seen, and you can bring as much as you want into the workplace or not, as, you have the agency to choose. Like if you have that choice, that's awesome. That's like the first sign. But the second piece is like feeling connected. And I think this plays into trust, right? So building those strong and meaningful relationships. Like if you can name like maybe 4 relationships like on your team or within your organization where you feel really connected, you're more likely to have that strong sense of belonging. If not, if you can't even name one person, that might signal, there's a culture of disconnect. And then that leads to the third piece, which is support. So it's getting what you need so you can do your best at work. And what I'm going to need is going to be super different from you and everybody else on your team, right? So it's being aware, right? If you're connected, it's like, oh, of course, Rhodes needs this, and he's going to rock that project out, right? So that's really huge. And then the last piece, which I really like, is this sense of pride. So like in the spirit of this month, but, pride being that the values that you have, when you think about how you behave in the world, that's in alignment with your organization's values. And like in that kind of alignment, there's a sense of pride, purpose, and who doesn't want to feel that? Who doesn't want to feel meaning when they show up in the workplace? And then I like talking about that. We can measure those things. And we can also talk about like what happens, like what's the cost if we don't build this in the workplace? And that's where like this kind of sting of exclusion comes in. So it's really just kind of the inverse of those 4 ingredients, right? Like if I'm not seen, I'm feeling invisible. If I'm not feeling connected, disconnect. If I'm not supported, I might feel discouraged. And if I don't feel pride, I'm feeling shame. And that's like such a powerful, it's an icky feeling, right? But like that shame of like, what is it about me that's not in alignment here? What is it about me that's there's something that makes me different isn't embraced? And we're in this era of like the Great Resignation. Last year, 47 million employees left their jobs. And pay and compensation definitely, is a factor of that. But the primary reason so many people were leaving is toxic workplace culture, right? Just like this element, these kind of ingredients are not there. And it's like, what is it all for? If I have all of these other options, or at least like, I can take some time, if you're privileged enough to be able to do that, and some people don't even have that privilege, but it's so bad, it's like, I'm out, and I'm going to find something else. So I think like employers, right, like we're in this moment where, you can be an employer of choice, and you can kind of say, we're going to try to change the way that we've been running things, or, you can be the employer that sticks their head in the sand and just stick to the status quo. But you're going to continue hemorrhaging, employees until hopefully you wake up and say, we got to do something different. Yeah.
So much good stuff in there. There's where do I want to go next? Because I have like 17 questions. So I'm gonna go one question, one memory that came to mind as you were talking about the having the connection aspect of that experience and having people that you have a meaningful connection with at work. It reminds me of for a number of years, one of the most important questions on employee experience surveys was, do I have a best friend at work? Which gets to that, whether you have that, you feel like you're a member of your chosen family as part of the people, the community that you work with. I want to just ask for your counsel here for a second to see if you like what I do or not, or if you suggest it to be different. The way that I think about it and talk to our clients about how we measure culture is really through the employee experience survey. We say it's really that's the mirror of how your employees are experiencing their culture. So is that how do you measure? Is that how you measure it, or you do have another approach?
Yeah. I mean, I do it in a number of ways, but definitely through surveying, as kind of on the quantitative side for all the data nerds who need to see things, especially if you can get an N big enough that's statistically significant. I think like those questions are really huge. My approach is kind of, when I talk about belonging, we talked about those ingredients, but make the primary things that make that foundation are psychological safety and trust building. So I'm like kind of like, asking like, do you have a best friend? Do you have someone who's going to have your back, right, to support you? That gets to kind of some of the trust that you have interpersonally. There's also trust with your leadership team. There's trust in the organization itself, so to measure that. I think on the psychological safety pieces, I think Amy Edmondson makes our jobs really easy, kind of like, can you do your work without fear of negative consequence? And so she kind of breaks that down with being able to ask for help when you need it, being able to admit to a mistake when you make one, being able to offer constructive feedback when you have it, without kind of retaliation, fear of negative consequences, losing out on a promotion, a stretch assignment, even losing your job. I mean, these are all things that are huge. And I think like, especially like, I mean, for us, like being a part of LGBT communities, right? Like how many times, just kind of in terms of covering, important parts of ourselves, did we do that? Because it's like, I don't know if my colleagues can handle all of me. I don't know if I could talk about my gender history of being socialized as a girl, and like people's minds aren't going to implode because it's too, it's like, I don't even want to do that right now. But like what the expense is like, we miss those opportunities to really get to know each other better, so that when we do need to have each other's backs, it's like, what, Brian's got me, like we have a deep relationship. And so I need some help on this project. I know he's going to have my back. And so, like bringing it back to leaders, right? The cost of doing nothing, if people think, oh, this belonging stuff, this kind of culture building stuff, we'll get to it, 3 years from now. I mean, what's the saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, so it's like, whatever you want your business to do, if you're not prioritizing this work, you're really at a disadvantage, especially in the environment that we're in right now.
Yeah, agree. Absolutely. Well, and what I heard there, and for all of you with us, hopefully, as I ask for counsel and advice from Rhodes, it helps you too. So have these conversations with the people at your organizations who are responsible for culture. It was borrowing from because I think one of the things that happens when we're creating employee experience surveys or some sort of assessment for ourselves is, how do I create these questions? Well, there are experts who've done lots of research who have then helped craft some questions, so we can borrow from those who have already solved those puzzles.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I will keep plugging Amy Edmondson, but I feel like she's such a gift to so many different fields, but especially for those of us doing this work. the psychological safety measures, it's base, I mean, we're just talking about being safe on the job. We're not talking about like trusting each other or feeling like, I belong. It's just like, that first measure is really, really key. So if we bring in the DEI components, who's most likely to have a high level of psychological safety and who's least likely to even feel safe, right? So if we're starting to think about people with a marginalized identity or multiple marginalized identities, that starts to get way more complicated. And so a big approach that I use is the work of John A. Powell's targeted universalism, right? So if we want everyone to belong in the organization, we have to have targeted interventions around those least likely to feel it, so that we all can kind of get to kind of an equitable place where it's we're starting to at least feel psychologically safe, and we can build upon that, right? So that's where I start with leadership teams, just to kind of think about that in a way that also allows them to kind of work through some of their own stuff, right? And I think one of the biggest things that I see with leaders is that, on paper, it's like, okay, we'll do this work. And I think some of the thought bubbles are not the fear of change, which I think a lot of people conflate, like, oh, people just don't like change. It's just like, that's just not true. If you were going to tell me, I'm going to give you a brand new bike. I love bike riding. So you're going to give me a new bike and you have to change your shoes and you have to change all your gear, but you're going to go faster. I'd be like, okay, sign me up. I'm ready for that change, right? It's more kind of the fear of loss. And it's just it's a false fear of I'm going to lose my power or status. And I think that kind of fear, it trips up loss aversion, right? Which is kind of like the fear of losing something is 2 times more powerful than gaining something, which I don't get that, but that's humans. That's how we work. And so I think loss aversion clouds leaders' better judgment of what they do gain, right? Which is just kind of, aside from a legacy of you're doing the right thing, which is, I would argue it is the right thing. We know what the business case is. We've got 40 years of data that confirms, like, at every point that an organization like an HR, we care about retention, we care about productivity, we care about people showing up and feeling purpose in their jobs. When we do this work, that's there. And in this era, people stick around for the long haul, when we do this. So I think leaders, really making space for them to kind of work through what they have to work through, is maybe for some of us, it's like, we were ready 5 years ago or 20 years ago to do this work. So catch up, leaders. And we also have to acknowledge where people are starting from. And some of us maybe might be brand new to this work. So we have to exercise that kind of grace.
Which can be hard to muster sometimes, but we do need to do it. Grace is, well, the way that we at Hummingbird talk about it is, and I certainly respect that there are systems of oppression that have been incredibly harmful and hurtful to communities. And so I understand the anger that can come with that. And sometimes I feel that anger myself, because there are things about my lived experience that have felt those moments of hurt. And what we try to focus on is, if we attack, let's use that word, then we put the other person in fight, flight, or freeze, and we are no longer having a conversation that's going to move us forward. So we say, like, how do we find ways to offer grace, as you mentioned, to allow for there to be a healthy space for dialogue and understanding that allows us to move forward in a positive direction. And I think it took us a long time to really think through how does that either meet or not meet the goal to breaking down systems of oppression. And because it feels like a slower burn, but I also think it's long-term, it's more meaningful. And I hear that that's sort of how you think about what you're doing with your organizations.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a long game. And I think that's the tension, right? I think that the tension that, and I think this is more for employees, that, it's just the frustration of this is not happening fast enough. And there's not the transparency. I think that it would be different if any of us, applied for our next great opportunity, and where we were applying, like, there was some acknowledgement of, this is our current culture. This is what we're seeing, that we've done some assessments. We're sharing this with you to say this is a work in progress. And, we are intentional about this is where we're heading, and we're starting to kind of name the kind of culture that we're trying to build. And we need you. You are a culture add to this. Please be a part of it. We want to give you as much information so you can make an informed decision. And too often what happens is we're searching, we're kind of like, researching, maybe a potential employer. There's the about us section, there's this beautiful statement about commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion, about culture, healthy culture, da, da, da. And then you show up maybe in the first week and you're kind of like, wait, in the interview process, everyone was saying this about this amazing culture. And yet I'm picking up things right now that are kind of running counter to that. The alignment is not there. And it right then, you're talking about building trust in the organization starts to get eroded pretty quickly. And then, right now, like, we can't afford that. I think if people really want to, be a part of like the great recruitment and keep people, like that, employers can't do that anymore. And especially with younger people, younger generations coming in where, I think I was reading an article about Zoomers, Generation Z, and it's kind of like the generation that wants it all, and that was kind of the frame. But what it was saying in the article is that, perhaps for older Gen Xers, baby boomers, traditionalists, that, these generations just didn't ask for as much as they could have, right? So I really like that take. And I just think it's important for those of us really actively building cultures, either in our own organizations or for a larger employer, be really mindful of kind of what employees want, what prospective employees want. And it's way more than I think many of us are anticipating. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree. The way that I think about it is that I'm, this new generation that has been entering and is entering the workforce, they're more vocal, and they're clear about what they expect, and they're not afraid to say, hey, you got to do better. I agree, in the conversations I've had with others, like peers of mine, I think we wanted those things too, but we just didn't feel like we had the space, the room, maybe the safety, to really challenge the systems that exist. And so I'm so grateful that they're with us in these organizations. And as someone who runs a business, I also appreciate the challenges for leaders, because I invite the team that I have the privilege to lead to challenge me, and in the spirit of honoring that that's going to happen anyway. So let's just allow it to be a healthy conversation. And sometimes it's really hard. And I think that leading today is, I believe that we're tracking in a direction that leadership management is going to be more human. It's also, I believe, inherently harder than anything that I learned growing up in management. And the things that that were the suggestions for good principles. Some of those still work, but so many of them have evolved as paradigms, and it's harder now. It's also more meaningful. So how are you helping leaders and managers through that transition? Because they have to go through a lot, and I know I'm one of those leaders who's going through a lot myself.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is coaching and equipping with skills that none of us were equipped with, right? Or we learned, as we fumbled to kind of be better versions of ourselves. So I think it's at least in the approach that I take through long-term learning engagements, right? So this is not, no one's going to master this in a 20 or I was going to say 20 minutes in an hour-long training or a day-long training or even a week-long training. I mean, this is about learning some skill, awkwardly practicing inclusive leadership skills, and being able to process them and get some coaching on them until you get to that kind of masterful or more skillful, I would say more skillful practice, right? And it's like learning something. It's like learning an instrument, right? I think sometimes for many of us in leadership positions, many people, you've worked hard. Many of us have worked hard to be where we're at. So there's a lot of skill in the thing that got us to where we are. right? And yet this moment is demanding kind of a new way of leading, or ways that weren't honored. So for some of us, maybe we've always led this way. And finally, like these skills are really being prioritized of like, oh my gosh, we have to be more collaborative. We have to kind of share some of our power. We have to give other people credits, like all of these things that kind of ran counter for us to even survive in the workplace. So it's kind of, it's maybe cognitive dissonance. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but like something is happening where it's like everything that we've learned, not everything, but a lot of the things that we've learned about what it means to be a leader, we have to consciously unlearn. And then we have to learn some new skills to be relevant in kind of the workplace that we find ourselves in right now. So it's awareness raising around that. But I think most importantly, it's not just raising awareness, right? It's like really giving a defined set of skills to say, like, these are the skills that are going to be most helpful. And I think, Brian, you offered a great example of like with your team of like, you know, I'm opening up, I'm open to hearing feedback, right? And just, you know, the leaders that I work, really trying to get them to see feedback as a gift, no matter how it's expressed, right? So, you know, maybe someone's really upset because they've been microaggressed for the 7th time at the day that day, and they're coming at you with like, this happened again. And it's kind of like, okay, thank you for sharing that. Like, if you could just do that as a leader, and even if you're not ready to respond, even if you're kind of having a reaction in your body, it's kind of regulating that and getting to a space, maybe taking care of yourself to process like, okay, that happened. What's the kernel of truth for this other person's experience that they cared enough to bring this to my attention? And, you know, how do I receive that with care and reflect it back when I'm ready to have like a more meaningful conversation of like, you know, hey, Brian, when you said this, you know, here's what I heard. Here's maybe where I caused harm, or here's like a learning lesson for me. Did I get that right? And, you know, kind of that nonviolent communication framework, for better or worse, I think it does help in kind of like meeting a conflict, even if you would describe it as a conflict. But the conflict isn't bad, right? You know, when we think about like group formation, you know, there's the forming, there's the norming, the storming before you perform, right? And too many of us, I think, you know, I moved out to the Pacific Northwest, so it's a culture of very kind of conflict avoidance. And I moved from New York City, which is kind of the opposite. So, you know, it's just interesting to see people's relationship to conflict as it relates to kind of feedback. And yet that's one of those skills, like if we can really embrace that, that can help leaders tremendously, because we don't know everything. In fact, we know probably very little, right? And if we're smart, we surround ourselves with a team of really amazing people that, you know, really can help the greater good of the organization, right? So, I mean, that's maybe one skill that I would give kind of as an example.
Yeah. Well, and one of the other evolutions, I'm like, what word do I want to use? Evolutions in these constructs is that I've seen is the need to, let me say that this started a different way. I learned, like so many of us, that perfection is the goal, which is not realistic for anyone. But since that's what we're trying to attain, I think a lot of us as leaders have tried to create a brand of perfection, which makes it really hard then to say, I got that wrong. I'm sorry. And so really tearing down that paradigm, and actually what I believe inherently is saying I got it wrong, apologizing in a genuine way, is actually credibility building and trust building and safety building. So it does all these other things that we weren't getting before.
Yeah. And that brings me back to Amy Edmondson. I told you I would talk about her a
You
lot.
love her, don't you?
Yeah, I do. But I feel in that place, right? It's kind of like, how do we create an environment where, one, we can recognize that the imperfections, the mistakes, the failures are so valuable to a workplace, right? That when we have strong and cohesive teams, and that's what she found in her research when she was looking at hospital teams, like literally life and death, right? That those hospital teams that were the most strong and cohesive were the ones where they were able to share, hey, we've made mistakes. In fact, like her research found that like the strong and cohesive teams actually made more mistakes. And that confused her. So when she started to do more research, she realized that those teams were more likely to say we made mistakes, so they were admitting to the mistakes, while other teams were probably making the same number of mistakes, and they were more willing to talk about them and work through them. And when they were able to work through those mistakes, that's where they had their innovation of, if we did this procedure different, or if we did this process different, we would have a way better result, right? So I think for us as leaders to recognize, like, if we model, we're human, we're not robots, we are going to mess up, we are going to maybe colossally mess up, right? And if we can normalize that, to recognize that that could be the moment where we're able to tweak something, where we can have like a business breakthrough, or at least like get a result that is desirable. And the only way that we can get there is to kind of break up with that desire, that maybe the way that we've been trained, like excellence equals perfectionism. And that's not true. Excellence is something different than being perfect. And perfect is a trap, because none of us are ever going to get there, right? So we'll always feel like we're not worthy if we're striving for that. We can strive towards excellence. The excellence we can achieve if we kind of acknowledge there's going to be a lot of mistakes along the way. I'm going to make them, you're going to make them, our team's going to make them. We don't want that to happen, right? But let's normalize when it does, that there's going to be some important learning lesson for all of us. And not to shame anybody when it happens, right? Because I could be the next person that makes the next mistake, but I think where a lot of organizations struggle is when one of their leading values is excellence, and then, you know, um, you know, I think that's where things can go sideways, where it's excellence equals perfection, and that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it's so not realistic. I love that you said we're humans and not robots. I say that all the time, and because I think there are so many aspects of how we've created organizational cultures that are asking us to be robots as how we show up, and it's just not possible. So I love this conversation. I want to bring in another dimension, though. So we've been talking about culture and the various ways to understand culture. We've talked about belonging. We've talked about how leadership is changing and evolving, and what workers today want from their organizations. Something that you've mentioned this word a number of times. I know I hear it. I don't know if others are keen into it. Is this word of equity and this intention around equity? And I know that in the conversations I have with the leaders that I get to work with, that the concept of equity is hard to understand sometimes, but we can usually get to the understanding of equity. It gets much harder to say, how do we start to create solutions that will right the wrongs or create that experience of equity? So I'd love for you to just share with us and share with the group, like, how do you think about equity, and how are you leaning into that to create cultures of belonging? What does that look like?
Yeah. So equity, first and foremost, is inequality. So I think, like, if we could start there, what we're striving for is not for everyone to have the same exact thing in the workplace, right? Because that's just not going to work. We all start at different places in terms of what our needs are and what it will take for us to thrive as individuals. So I think, like, there's two ways of thinking about equity. One is kind of like interpersonal equity. And that's something that I alluded to earlier, just kind of talking about belonging on that component of support. So getting what you need so you can do your best work, and being realistic that your needs are going to be super different from your colleagues. So that's kind of like how we kind of behave with each other and how we interact. The other component is really recognizing the systems and structures that create inequities, right? And so I can use myself as an example, as one person whose my experiences are probably super different than, the rest of the folks that are here right now. Maybe a few of you can relate, right? But being a trans person, I got involved in equity, doing DEI work as necessity 20 years ago, because I was hired for something completely different. When I got into the workplace, I realized, oh my God, I've already kind of like socially transitioned. I was kind of medically transitioning at that time. And what I needed, just to kind of show up and, do the thing that I was hired for, it wasn't very clear how I could get those things that I needed. So what I needed to do was to work with people. And fortunately, the employer that I worked with, and again, this is like 20 years ago, they were very supportive and said, we have no idea how to support you. So we want to do this with you because we want to make this better, not just for you, but for future trans people that come through this organization. And so we work together, but like just those examples of, being able to get healthcare that kind of worked for me. That was a huge challenge. Being able to have identity documents that aligned with who I am, because I hadn't yet legally transitioned, right? And so just getting a name tag that was my name, just to be respected at its most basic level. I'm not even talking about pronouns, but just like my name on a name tag or an email, right? So these are like, this is a very simple example, but it's showing like one person's experience in an organization that from the organization's perspective, everyone's treated the same. So we're all equal. Everybody gets the same thing, but it didn't allow probably many other people for different reasons to thrive in it. So if we can think about interpersonal equity and then kind of structural, like organizational equity, those are kind of like, we can separate that out a little bit. Because I think for some of us, if we're not the CEO or a commissioner or the executive director, we probably feel like we have very little power to change those structures. Mm-hmm. Yet we have a lot of power in how we relate to each other of like, Brian, how can I help? Like, I know that things are going on with your family. You shared that with me. How can I support you today? Just to kind of get the things done so you don't have to stress here, right? Like that might be an example of, I might not be a leader with a capital L, but that's a leadership behavior, and I can deliver that kind of equity. When I'm getting involved with an organization that really wants to work around policies and structures, that gets me excited because then we can talk about some of those organizational inequities. And in order to identify those, we need to work with those folks inside of the organization least psychologically safe. Like, what about this organization is making you feel unsafe? Is it the people? Is it the way that the organization is structured? Is it the way that we kind of advance talent? And it's going to take, yes, survey employees. I think the other piece is like those focus groups of really being able to kind of interact with people at lots of different levels, people of different identities, to really get at, where might those barriers be? Because for a lot of the leaders that are kind of, at the highest levels of an organization, they've kind of navigated, they've worked their way, even if there were inequities, they figured out, a workaround. But, they don't necessarily have that firsthand experience of knowing kind of where all those trapdoors are. And so I think that's why people have a hard time really kind of acknowledging the full scale of equity, because it's big, and it's not just the workplace, right? It's kind of like all of the ways that we arrive to the workplace. So kind of thinking about our family and our community structure. It's thinking about schooling, education, trade schools, like what opportunities did we have leading up to arriving to the workplace? And those are big, so when companies, if you're in a bigger corporation, or a bigger organization that has lofty commitments to the environment or social or, the ESG kind of commitments, so environmental, social or governance, these are the pieces that can get at equity if we're really strategic and invest back into our communities, if we're mindful of how our organization is having an impact on our environment, and if we're thinking about ways of being more transparent of kind of how the highest levels of leaders are operating within our organization equitably, like it's big. So we can find different entry points of what feels possible for us, and for each one of us too, that might look a little bit different.
Yeah, I really appreciate the lens on that individual component in the equity conversation, because it's something that I feel some days, probably most days, of like, I'm really trying to change the world, and I also know I'm just one human, and and my ego is not big enough for me to think that I can change the world, but I can change make a difference in a person's life, or in a team's life, or in our company's life in some situations, and I know that there are lots of other humans out there who are also doing that, and collectively that's where the change happens. But we have to sort of pay attention to what's within our scope of possibility.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what will it take for you to give yourself permission to do that, for everybody that's here, right? Because we can make lots of excuses, especially if we think about equity from like that kind of systemic level of like, oh my gosh, that's too big. Like I'm gonna check out. But what is it that you might be able to do just to have that positive influence of showing up for someone on your team to support them by giving them what they need, and that's gonna take getting to know the people that are on your team, and that takes time and that takes a commitment. So, but and as you said, right, like if we all just did one little teeny tiny thing, even if it was for today, that would have massive rippling effects, across the entire world.
Something that I've heard from several CEOs that I've worked with, and I'm curious if you've heard something similar, and how you've been, and more importantly, how would you respond to this? So I start talking to them about all the things we're talking about here, about how do we create, and of course the language that I use is human-centered workplaces, and that means allowing humans to be human and acknowledging that perfection is not a reality, acknowledging that there are emotions that humans come with because they're not robots, acknowledging that there are systems of oppression and that we have to create space so that we can talk about them and we can tackle them on an individual or organizational basis. So all of these, and they're like, Brian, that all sounds great and important, and we should do that. How do I do all of that and still run my business? Because it feels like that's going to take over my entire organization. One leader is like, we're just going to have an emotional roller coaster every day at our company if we do this. And fortunately, I haven't seen that happen. But have you had those conversations with leaders as well, as they're trying to say, how do I sort of shift my thinking about what an organizational construct looks like?
Yes, yeah, yeah. And I think sometimes, and I guess I'm assuming, and I probably shouldn't do that, but I think what I'm hearing underneath that, but I guess this is how I'll frame it, is that it feels like, based on all of the things that I just shared in that previous response to you about equity, it's like, well, I have to do all of that, or it's just not going to be enough. And it's not that, right? It's not that. It's as you said, if we're going to bring our full human self into the workplace, like what makes us human, what like the best parts of ourselves are the feelings, right? And too many of us fear feelings in general, let alone inside of the workplace, where for many of us, we've been trained all of that stuff we leave at home, and we just show up as kind of like doing our functions and our tasks. And when we sever that, right, that then compromises relationships. And so I think what leaders can do that's well within their reach is, even in meetings, like kind of rethink a check-in, right? Of just, if you're managing a team and you've got, I don't know, 10 people on your team, 5 people, I don't know how big your teams are. But, especially like if you're in a hybrid workplace, the Zoom is a fabulous tool where you've got a chat, and kind of like asking people to kind of contribute, kind of a temperature check of what's going on, and making those kind of icebreakers interesting, not just kind of like, how are you feeling, but kind of, what's a song that brought joy to you today, or something where you can kind of connect and be real before you kind of jump into whatever's on the agenda. It might sound silly, but those are the things that you start to really get to know different people. Like, oh, Brian, I didn't know that you like BB King. Cool. Like we can connect about jazz or something afterwards. But that's basic and it's super simple. Kind of beyond that, is for leaders to kind of acknowledge that, we are the workplace, we're a microcosm of the world that we're in. So to kind of acknowledge what's going on in the world when things are happening, right? And to acknowledge that, whether it's, a shooting that's happening, in a different part of the country, which is frightening and kind of like our reality right now, is to name that, to not use euphemisms, and to talk about how that can have an impact on the people in the workplace, and giving people that space, right? Having some more flexibility. There's lots of examples around, what leaders can do. I think I think making excuses though, and just saying it's too much, we don't have time, and it would be a distraction to what it is that we do. I think that could be possibly the worst thing, because it's almost like meeting the moment with silence, and being a little, I guess, aloof. I don't know if that's the right word, but just kind of not really plugged in to what people are craving, especially from leaders. And I think over these past 2.5 years, so many folks wanted to hear more about what leaders were doing, how they were thinking about kind of just how we're structuring work right now to kind of get through the pandemic, to get through these times. So the over communication was almost well received. And a lot of the conversations I was having with folks that I was consulting with was kind of that concern of, is this too much? Are we over communicating? And at least from what we were seeing out in the field, it's like, no, you need to communicate more. People really feel disconnected right now. And so the workplace in some ways, even today, is still kind of, it has the potential of being a sanctuary from a lot of the stuff that's happening in the world. So that again can be the opportunity if you want to be an employer of choice and to help your company be that. How can you be that sanctuary in the midst of this storm that we're all living through right now?
Now I have images of the Hunchback of Notre Dame in my head. There's a beautiful song in there about sanctuary, which is just coming to mind for me. So, and I love to connect the world to movies and music. So I love that. You've just, I know we're sort of in our last few minutes. So you just sparked a question for you that I hadn't thought of coming into this conversation. But there's this reality that we are facing today, and have been for the last couple of years. All the things happening in our world. One of the evolutions of workplaces is that more people now work remotely or virtually, and so when you talk about this, the way that I often say it is say it out is that humans have a desire to be connected and to be part of something, and the construct of virtual working, where we work from home in our by ourselves, many of us, doesn't have that same level of connection and togetherness as we had in workplaces before. And I agree with you, though, that organizations can be a sanctuary and can be a place that can really, again, the language I use is humans, where humans thrive. So what are the things you're talking about in with your clients around how do they create belonging and connection in this virtual workplace?
Yeah, I mean, it's ongoing. So I think these are maybe some promising practices or ideas. But I really like the use of kind of these drop-in hours that people are doing, managers or just kind of fellow colleagues of, hey, every Friday, kind of from 8 to 10, we're going to be kind of doing this co-working. So we're going to come in, we'll do a check-in, we'll be working together, and then we'll do a check-out. We're finding that it actually kind of increases connectivity. It also increases productivity, and it makes people feel connected when they're not able to be in that kind of shared group space. But on that question about hybrid work, right? Like where some people are actually in physical space while other people are still kind of working remotely, is kind of like, have you seen the OWL technology, or do you know what I'm talking about with the OWL? So if you were, say you had, a couple of your employees inside of an office, you're all around the table, right? And maybe I'm kind of joining you remotely with another person, in order for us to feel connected, there's now technology, and I'm sure there's other things, but I've seen an OWL where the OWL sits at the table, and the OWL functions as the camera, one of the cameras that's here. So for everybody that's participating remotely, the OWL moves its eyes towards whoever around the table is speaking. So it increases that kind of engagement. And so it's the best, I think it's kind of one of those working technologies where I think there's some people have opinions about it, but it's trying to kind of bridge this reality that most of us will likely be in some kind of hybrid work situation at some point. So I think technology can help with some of that too. I think our only limitation with creativity in the ways that we're working now is our only limitation is our creativity, right? To try to see other ways of, this worked for me, I'd like to share this with the group, and test it out, and so I would encourage people to test and change, because I think we're still in it to say, this is the tried and true way of building connectivity. I think one of the best ways is for us to kind of experiment together, because this is the first time we've been here, right? And so we're trying to share best or promising practices.
I love that phrase, promising practices. I'm going to borrow that.
Yeah.
And I'll share one that we've started to use at Hummingbird. Something that we realized is that in this virtual, now Hummingbird is 100% virtual. We all work from home in our various, homes across the country. And because of that reality, it has driven more written communication. So where we're communicating and trying to exchange, dialogue, messages around sometimes difficult topics in Slack. And, of course, so many of us learned years ago that trying to communicate about sensitive things in writing is not necessarily the best answer, but we're now in this new environment. And so we're like, okay, I'm going to use the tool that's available. And so what we realized is we had a few moments where there was, unnecessary or unintended, anxiety that was sparked by something that was said. And so then this person's like, okay, can we talk? And then so a week later, they're like, what was that all about for that, that week? And so we have implemented a safe word, and if you're having a Slack conversation, so that it which is pineapple, it's and just to say, hey, like there's something that isn't feeling good about this conversation for me, because we can't see verbal or nonverbal cues in those moments, and so that way they can say that and add a little levity to the situation, and then we can jump on a call and say, like, let's figure this out together. So that's something we're trying to see if it helps avoid, it's always unintended, but it still happens.
I love that. I think that's really smart, and and I'm sure it will continue to evolve as you use that practice. And yeah, I mean, Slack is one of those really great tools as well, and you kind of name some of its limitations. Another interesting, we're kind of like sharing tools and things like that. Loom is one of those really great tools where it's just, it's kind of an app where you can record yourself and share a message. So sometimes, and I think this is this kind of meeting different people's communication styles. So I'm definitely a writer who speaks, whereas, there's so many gifted people in my life who just kind of riff. They're ready to, like, they have a book, all they have to do is speak, and it's there. And so Loom might be a great technology for those people where it's like, I have something to communicate that's near and dear to my heart, but like writing it out feels overwhelming. So I'm just going to hit record and share this and share it with the team. So, I think that's another kind of going back to basics, when you're thinking about interpersonal equities, like, Brian, what's the best way that I can reach you? Do you prefer email or text, or, because I think sometimes that's also generational, or I want a phone call, right? But that can really go a long way in kind of, just building a good rapport with your colleagues. But I love the safe word and written writing, because that you do miss out on so many important cues that even though we're not sharing the same physical space, I mean, there's so many micro movements in our face that say so much, so for those of us who are sighted, that's definitely very helpful for us, just to kind of guide in the conversation of what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and for those of us who can also hear the even just the tone, like you can catch the undercurrents of what someone is not saying, and you lose all of that in the written word, which is a beautiful form of communication, but it has some challenges.
Definitely.
Well, we are at the finish line. Rhodes, thank you so much for saying yes and for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and sharing about how leaders can create cultures of belonging. I learned so much today, and I'm sure that others did as well. So I'm sure that there are going to be people who want to follow you and connect with you and buy the book. Can you give them the spiel about where they find all those things?
Yeah, you can find everything about me at rhodesperry.com. That's probably the best place. So if you want one place, that's a good place to go. And I would encourage you, if you like conversations like these, I host a summit every year. It's called the Belonging at Work Summit. And this year it runs July 11th through the 15th. And if you go to belongingatworksummit.com, pretty easy, you can register. The summit is 100% free and it's 100% virtual. So we really just want to get out as much information as possible. And we've got about 20 different DEI thought leaders. We're talking about some of the big things that get in the way of our DEI commitments succeeding. And we're ending the week by screening My Name is Polly Murray, which if you have not seen that documentary, it is amazing. And the producer, one of the producers will be fielding questions after we screen the film. So the theme this year is Imagine Belonging at Work on a Global Scale. And so we really wanted to show that film because Polly Murray was a person in like the 1930s. Polly was assigned female at birth. A lot of people use they and them pronouns because Polly tried to transition in the 30s and had some pretty big barriers. But they were kind of the legal mind that influenced Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on creating, the civil rights, basically the legislation that allows many of us to enjoy the freedoms that we have today. Even though we have a long way to go, Polly was that visionary during a time that they described as Jane Crow, and lived through that, and still their vision, we're still working to bring into reality. So I couldn't think of a better person to kind of feature during that week than that film, and really lifting up Polly's story.
That sounds wonderful. Awesome. Well, we will be sure to share that with our community as well and encourage them to join you in July. So thank you again. And for all of you with us today, thank you for being with us. Happy Pride, and stay safe and be well.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Ella.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, take care.
Thanks, Rhodes.